Hello again, and welcome to the St. Louis Blues Hockey Legends Podcast. Tom Calhoun here to shine a light on the stories of those instrumental in blues history. The Blues Legends Podcast is presented by Sarah Honda O'Fallon, Illinois. Check out their 618 Sarah Bucks offer at sarahhondaofallon.com. A participating sponsor, the Gateway Grizzlies. The greatest night in baseball is August 31st, and the Grizzlies are in the Frontier League playoffs. Visit gatewaygrizzlies.com for tickets. On this episode, we change the approach a bit. There are legendary people, and there are legendary happenings. We will discuss some of the important moments in blues history with the man who has written about the blues for a few decades and has written a virtual history book on the blues with 100 things blues fans should know and do before they die. The very popular blues beat writer for The Athletic, Jeremy Rutherford, shares stories and more. We'll get started in 60 seconds.
When it's time to find your next car, what's changed in your life? What's driving you to start the process? What are you really looking for? These are the questions we're asking at Sarah Honda. We believe in real communication, real problem solving, and trustworthy long-term relationships with our customers. We're part of your community, and we want you to be part of ours. At Sarah Honda, the experience drives everything. You've got a lot going on in life, and you depend on your car to get you to places you need to be. So when it's time for maintenance or repair, we know you need it done fast and done right. Convenience and quality customer service with team members you can trust. That's what you're looking for. We'll get you safely back on the road and back to your busy life. At Sarah Honda, the experience drives everything.
And on this episode of the Blues Hockey Legends Podcast, we're thrilled to have the longtime writer and coverer of the blues, Jeremy Rutherford. JR, welcome aboard.
Thanks for having me, Tom. What an honor here. I've watched several episodes. I learned something every time I listened to one of your legends, and when you called to see if I could come on and talk through some stories in blues history, just what an honor to hear from you. Well,
I think you might still be working on legendary status. You're kind of a young guy, but
never get there.
But you're pretty darn close, if not there already. And look forward to honoring you at some point again, just for your own sake. But today we're going to talk a little bit about the legendary stories in blues history. I think when I labeled this podcast St. Louis Blues Hockey Legends, we don't have to limit it to the people of the past. We can talk about the stories of the past too, and they are legends. And so that's what I thought we would do here on this podcast. Many of you know Jeremy, a senior writer for The Athletic, covering the Blues. He's covered the team since 05-06. Including a dozen years at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. You remember the Post-Dispatch before the internet took over, right?
Yeah.
And they're still, of course, going strong. He's the author of Bernie Federko, My Blues Note, and 100 Things Blues Fans Should Know Before They Die. There's a new edition. You might hold up that book, Jeremy, so we can plug it right off the bat.
Yeah, Tom, the original was written in 2014, and as we know, that's 5 years before the Blues won the Stanley Cup. So those Blues fans out there might have a copy of the white cover, white and blue. That's the 2014 original. But after that, we did a reprint. You have the older one there. I have the reprint that was written after the 2019 Stanley Cup. And we changed out 5 chapters, and any reference there was to the Blues not winning the Stanley Cup, we, of course, had to go in there, and that was fun to change that to have won the Stanley Cup now. So a few more tales in this one, but just make sure if you do go to Amazon and order the book, or you go to Barnes & Noble, wherever you go, you probably want to grab the bright yellow cover because that's got the updated information.
Yeah, and those of you who have that in your library or think about giving it for a Christmas gift, make sure you get the right one and the updated one from after the Cup. And it's got the yellow cover. For those of you just listening and not viewing on YouTube, it's got the yellow cover, not the white. So let's talk about Jeremy Rutherford first of all, before we delve into some of the historic moments in blues history. Tell us about your hometown, growing up, what kind of family life you had, where did that happen, and so forth.
Yeah, Tom, I grew up in St. Louis. I've never lived outside a 20-mile radius. I've moved probably 5 or 6 times in my life, but never outside of 20 miles. So I'm born and bred St. Louis. I grew up a blues fan. I had Curtis Joseph posters in my room growing up. Matter of fact, he and I, that book that I wrote, he also wrote a book for the same company, the same publisher, Triumph. And so I gave him a ride one time and I told Curtis Joseph that you're never going to believe this, but one time, Curtis, I took a poster of yours and I cut it into mini strips and I taped each strip to the mini blinds in my room so that when I walked in my room, you could turn the blinds and they'd open and close. And when they closed, there you were making a save. And he said, "Oh, I saved you from the sunlight there." Just growing up a Blues fan, I never thought that I would cover hockey. I never planned to cover hockey. I thought I'd probably grow up and help cover the Cardinals or cover the St. Louis Rams when they came. And in 2005, as you mentioned, the Post-Dispatch came to me and said, "Would you love to cover the Blues?" And I said, "Certainly." So it's been a fun ride ever since. This will be my 21st season. I got a long ways to go to catch up to you, uh, and I've
Few
written
years.
a couple stories about your long run. I love the sport of hockey. Now my son plays hockey. I'm at the rink all the time. And I just, to put it in a nutshell, I just love to show up at the rink every single day, find the story that fans and readers are talking about, asking about, get the answers to those questions. And my favorite, Tom, are the human interest stories. Anytime you can sit down with a current blues player and tell readers something that they don't know about their favorite player, it's just still a joy to have that opportunity to go into the room and have access to those interviews and write those stories.
Where'd you go to high school? That's the old St. Louis question.
Yeah, I went to Lutheran South, and I owe a lot to Lutheran South, and a shout out to my English teacher, newspaper teacher at the time, June Hill. She was a big supporter. She said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to cover sports for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch." And she said, "You can do it. I'll help you." And I'll never forget when I wrote my first article for the Post-Dispatch. This would have been probably 1995. Tom, you remember you had to put the coin in the machine, right? The paper dispenser.
Oh,
And
I do remember that. Yeah.
the night before, because I knew my article was going to be published the next day, it was about a high school football wide receiver. I knew the article was coming out. I went and got $10 worth of quarters from a 7-Eleven or what have you. And the next morning, I found the closest paper dispenser, and I'd put 50 cents in, open it, take a paper, close it, put 50 more cents in, open it. But people said, "Are you crazy? All you got to do is just grab the whole stack of papers in there." But of course, I didn't want to do that to the company. So
Yeah.
I've started writing at the Post-Dispatch. I might have still been at Lutheran South. I was about 19 years old, 18, 19, so maybe just out of Lutheran South, and uh, and started covering high school sports, and then a little bit of University of Illinois, and then went on to the Blues and the Cardinals and the Rams.
Did you get some college in somewhere?
I snuck some college in at the University of Missouri St. Louis. The funny story is, I went over to Afton Athletic Association and I was interviewing a youth coach, youth softball coach. And when I asked him for the interview, if he had a couple minutes, he kind of stepped back and, "You want to interview me?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm used to being on the other side of this." And I said, "Who are you? You're a coach." He said, "I'm the deputy sports editor at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch." And and so anyway, Mike Smith is his name, and I owe him a lot. He brought me on at the Post-Dispatch, and he said, "If you want to go to Mizzou, that's fine, that's great, but there's nothing I can really do for you if you go to Mizzou. If you stay in town and go to UMSL, then I can get you covering high school sports for us." And so I went to UMSL. I got up to about 100 credit hours, and they were calling me. The Post-Dispatch was calling me 5 times a week to cover high school games. There was no time for school was my excuse. So I stopped going to college. I'm still about 20 hours short. I think I found a letter in my closet the other day that said, "If you still want to finish school, this letter is probably about 30 years old." And but I don't think I'm going to get to the finish line with the degree there.
I think you're doing pretty well without it. So Let's move on and talk about some of the things you've written about in the blues book and some legendary moments, if you will, from blues history. And, I went back and started thinking about what qualifies as a legendary moment. And, you got a lot of things in the book that we could refer to, but I picked out a few, and maybe we'll do this again later on with some more of them. But let's talk first of all about Scotty Bowman and the early blues, and they uh, had a good thing going early on, but they didn't really get it going until they made the trade with the New York Rangers for Red Berenson and Barclay Plager. They sent Ron Stewart and Ron Atwell to the Rangers. Neither of those guys turned out to be, what you'd call great players, but both Berenson and Barclay Plager turned out to be, heart and soul players, and Berenson became the first really outstanding offensive player in the Western Conference back then.
Yeah, and it's interesting. That's a great story that you pick out, a great starting point for our conversation here. And, I do want to point out that when I wrote this book, the way that I came up with these topics is, I needed 100 of them. It's 100 things you need to know about the blues before you die. And so I actually set up a lot of interviews with people such as Bobby Plager, your dear friend as well, and writers who covered the team for the Post-Dispatch going back to the 1970s, and took these people to lunch. And I said, "Hey, tell me your favorite blues stories." And Barclay Plager coming to St. Louis, Red Berenson coming to St. Louis was definitely on that list. And what I can tell you about those times, and Scotty Bowman putting that team together, the Solomons owning the team, it was a situation where they had a plan in the expansion draft, and they were going to go for older players. They were going to go for guys 35 plus years old, with a lot of games in the league and experience, and come in and try to be successful right away, and hope that the Blues could catch on in St. Louis. We're talking obviously the late 1960s. And so, if I could say something about Al Arbor, it's heart and soul. He came here to St. Louis, and he was the first captain of the Blues. And this is obviously, he goes on to a legendary coaching career with the New York Islanders, but he was a player here. And you're going to look at his stats, and you're not going to see much, but it's what he did off the ice, and then also on the ice with his heart and soul style. But off the ice, for the book, I interviewed him before he passed, and his wife Claire, had them both on the phone together. And what a joy it was to interview both of them about those days when the team was kind of coming together. And the part that stuck out to me about the conversation was Claire saying none of the players knew each other, so we had to try to get some chemistry going. So we invited the entire team over to our house and would have parties. And today, 2025, you think about teams having parties, that's pretty common. But, we're talking 1967, 68, and the Arbors, Al and Claire, are inviting the entire team to come over and get to know each other. So they said those were very, very important to the early success of those teams coming together.
Well, I didn't expect you to go in that direction, but I'm glad you did, because that tells you a lot about the chemistry that the team had back in the early days that really I think kind of endeared them to the people of St. Louis. In those days, it was a hard ticket to get into the old arena, and people would come dressed up like they were going to church on Sunday and scream their heads off, and it was just a party every time the Blues played.
Yeah, I'm 50 years old. I just turned 50, so born in 1975. So I wasn't around in those days, but that was the best part about writing this book, is because I feel like it made me a better beat writer for this team currently, because now I have a better handle on the past and how the tradition with this team got started. And after talking to so many people, and those people are recalling stories themselves from 30, 40 years prior, it's hard to know what's fact, what's fiction. But I've heard stories that the Solomons wanted this place immaculate, talking about the old arena. And that was an older barn at the time. Remember, they get it from the Wirtz family in Chicago, and then they renovate it themselves. And so I've heard stories such as they'd start painting one end of the arena, and by the time they circled around, they'd start again on the inside just to keep it with a fresh coat of paint. I remember somebody telling me a story for the book that the water in the toilet, Tom, the Solomons wanted it blue, so they put the blue dye in there. And then, of course, there was a bowling alley in there, and you mentioned that people dressed to the nines. It was the place to be if you wanted to be seen in St. Louis. You were at a Blues hockey game, and you were in the best outfit that you could find.
No doubt. Well, let's move on to Mr. Scotty Bowman. William Scott Bowman, thought of as a genius coach back in the early days of the Blues. He coached the Blues to those three Stanley Cup appearances in the late 60s and in 1970. And then he started to want to run the show himself, and the Solomons weren't too interested in that. They had ideas about how things should go, and so he has disagreements with ownership and leaves the Blues in 71 and shocked all of us who were alive back then because we thought, oh man, we've got this young guy coach who's going to be here forever and ever, and we're going to be in the Stanley Cup every year. Well, he goes on to coach the Canadians to 5 cups and winds up winning 9 in his various locations around his career. And Scotty told me on this podcast back in early this year that it was just a matter of he wanted control of the hockey operation, and the Solomons had ideas about how the roster should be constructed, and he just felt like he needed to leave.
Yeah, if I had to put together a bucket list of assignments that I've had in my sports writing career, interviewing Scotty Bowman would be right at the top of that list. And so, like you, having him on your podcast, I was able to get in touch with him for the book. And you'll probably agree with me here. Even though he's what in his 90s now, it's
92, I think. Yeah.
yeah, the memory is uncanny. Like
Yeah.
you talk to him and you say, "Hey Scotty, I want to ask you about this story," and he'd say, "Oh yeah, it was a Tuesday night. It was 67 degrees. I remember that I ate a pizza the night before, and and so it was amazing." So you feel like when you're talking to him about these events, you're getting some pretty good detail on what actually happened behind the scenes, not only with his hiring and then when he left the St. Louis Blues, but a lot of other stories that I'm sure we'll touch on in this hour. But yeah, everybody that hears the name Scotty Bowman now, they think Hall of Famer, they think Montreal Canadiens, they think Detroit Red Wings, they think Stanley Cups, Pittsburgh Penguins.
Mhm.
They think about the leader with the most victories in NHL history, but probably not a lot of people, we have to admit, connect him to the St. Louis Blues. But he's one of the main reasons for the success that they had coming out of the gate with the 3 trips to the Stanley Cup Finals. He was a part of the roster construction that I touched on earlier, acquiring the players who were experienced in the league. And it was unfortunate that he left after a few short years. And yeah, I'm sure he touched on a little bit of detail of why he left. One of the things is the Solomons wanted to trade Red Berenson. They didn't feel that
Right.
he would be around when the team was ready to win, and Scotty Bowman disagreed with that, didn't want him to trade Red Berenson. And then also with Al Arbour, Scotty wanted to handpick Al Arbour as the next coach of the St. Louis Blues. The Solomons felt like he could still play defense for them, and they made a deal that Al would coach after his playing days were over. And then the Solomons reneged on that, according to Scotty. And so he felt like there were just kind of several differences between him and the Solomons at the time, and that it was time to move on.
And we can only speculate as to how the Blues history would have changed had he stayed around. But, look what he did after he left. He was pretty darn successful. So we thought that, uh, deserved a little bit of time here on this particular podcast as a legendary moment. We move along a few years, and the Blues are, establishing themselves in the 1970s. Gary Unger's here, and a lot of players that we could mention. But Unger was kind of the star quality guy back in the mid 70s to later 70s. And after the 1976-77 season ended, Gary decided to host a party on his uh, I don't guess it's a ranch, his property out in
Right.
Gray Summit, Missouri, on Memorial Day of 1977. And this is the day that the team loses what is thought of as an up and coming star in the league, Bob Gassoff. He and some other players were riding dirt bikes as part of the party, and he runs into a car with the dirt bike, and obviously that didn't go well for him. And Bruce Affleck was one of the other players riding bikes with him at the time. And it was a tragedy that Gary Unger relived for us on our podcast earlier this year, and he
Yeah.
still gets very emotional about recalling that day. And um, Gassoff, for those who didn't know him or know about him, was, he was a fighter. He was a really good defenseman, but he was also one of the toughest guys in hockey at the time. Even though he was 5'10", 190 pounds, he'd fight anybody, and he was feared around the league, even though he wasn't the biggest guy in the world. So losing him was another setback in a string of unfortunate things that happened back in those days.
Yeah, it's arguably the most tragic story in blues history, and one that was tough to write for the book. Fortunately, I was able to get in touch with a few of the people who were there that day, including Bob Plager and Bruce Affleck. And the story they tell is, yeah, it's tough to digest. But I believe that Gary Unger had the party a couple years in a row. This was kind of a thing that the team liked to do. They went out to the property in Grace Summit, and the way that I understand the story, they were on four-wheelers for a bit of the day and then put the four-wheelers down. And there were a couple bikes laying there, and Bruce Affleck jumped on the larger bike, and then there were two kind of mini bikes. And Bob Gassoff got on one, and a younger kid, 12 years old, got on the other. And in the meantime, somebody who was helping Gary Younger with the party had run to the store to get more drinks, more soda, more ice. And when that gentleman was driving back to the party, he was kind of coming over the hill, and I believe Bruce Affleck kind of crossed paths with him and got by him. And then when the vehicle continued to go forward, Bruce told me that the vehicle was speeding, and it wound up hitting Mr. Gassoff. And so the Blues lost a tremendous person, a player, as you mentioned, who was a rising player. I've talked to Bernie Federko about what Bob Gassoff meant to the organization at the time, and he felt those teams in the coming years weren't nearly as successful as they could have been had they had Bob Gassoff. And off the ice, his wife Diane, she was pregnant with their son at the time, and so the part of the story that really sticks with me still today, Tom, is Barkley and Bob Plager making a pledge that they would be at the hospital the day that she were to deliver. And that was just a few months later after the incident. And Bob Plager told me he remembers the phone call. He gets a call and it's Barkley and he says, "Bob, let's go." And so Bob jumped in his car and they got to the hospital and they were there for the delivery. And I'll add this. I did not know years and years ago who Bobby Gassoff Jr. was. He was around the rink a lot. I eventually asked who he was, and somebody told me, and then I put two and two together. We're going back, 15, 20 years. And what I witnessed was every time I saw this gentleman, who I later knew as Bobby Jr., the Blues always took him under their wing, whether it was the older players like the Bobby and Barkley Plager, when he was born, or whether it was the players in the 80s, players in the 90s know who Bobby Gassoff, players 10, 15 years ago know who he is. He's intertwined with the Blues organization in terms of him being around, them being supportive of him, and them being there every step of the way for Bobby Gessoff Jr. He went on to become a Navy SEAL, a ton of success. He was a hockey player as well. And it gives you goosebumps to think about how this organization rallied around that tragic situation and made him part of the family after the passing of his father.
Great stuff there, JR. And I'll cap off this part of the podcast by saying I've been in touch with Bobby Jr., and he's agreed to come on the podcast
Oh,
here in the
wow,
near
that'd be great.
future. And he was in Alaska when I talked to him in supporting Bobby the Third as he
Oh,
was playing in a hockey tournament up there.
yeah.
So, yeah. So I'm looking forward to talking about Bobby Jr., talking with Bobby Jr. about his father that he didn't know, and now another generation. in the Gassoff family.
I'll
So
be looking forward to that one.
yeah, that's coming up pretty soon, I think. So moving forward a little bit, I was working a Blues game the night of the Brett Hull trade, and we didn't really know much about Brett Hull when that all happened. He was a young guy, 23 years old, playing for the Calgary Flames, and he comes to the Blues in this trade along with Steve Bozak. And the Blues traded away from two pretty significant players, Rob Ramage and Rick Wamsley, in this deal. So everybody's wondering what is going on here. And of course, the professor, Ron Caron, pulled that deal back in those days. And I recall after that game running into him in the Blues offices at the arena, and just by chance, and he says, "Calhoun," French growl. He's Calhoun. You will really like this Brett Hull kid. He could really shoot the puck. And, and I said, well, I hope you're right, because he's certainly got the lineage and the genetics to be able to do that, being Bobby Hull's kid. But that was the start of his Hall of Fame, ascension into being a great hockey player, and maybe saved hockey for St. Louis.
Yeah, a little bit of fun fact. I hope I have this information correct. I believe Brett Hull was a healthy scratch for the Calgary Flames during the Monday Night Miracle. I don't. He
Wow.
was around the team during the playoffs when he was still with them prior to the trade to St. Louis. But yeah, what a. I mean, it's number one story in Blues history, probably outside of winning the Stanley Cup, is the trade for Brett Hull. And I do recall interviewing Bobby Plager several times. He's featured a lot throughout the book. That's because he knows everything and was around for everything, right? But he was a scout at the time, one of his many titles that he had with the organization. He always said that he got promotions and had different titles, but he never got a raise. But uh, but Bobby Plager said that Ron Kron sent him on some scouting trips to see Brett Hull. I believe he went to Moncton a couple times, and so this is back in the day. Today the Blues can just pull up a video and watch a kid in Russia score two goals the night before. But this is when you're sending Bobby Plager out to watch Brett Hull and get the scouting report. And Bobby Plager told a great story. He said that Ron Kron would call him the next day after the Moncton game and say, "Tell me about Brett. How did he do last night?" And Bobby Plager would say, "Well, he did have a hat trick and he did have an assist, so he had 4 points last night. But Ron, I got to tell you, this guy doesn't play defense. He doesn't get back. He's a coach killer. If we get him, he's probably you're gonna go through two or three coaches with this guy." And he said Ron Kron's response was, "Tell me again how many goals he scored." "Well, he did have a hat trick, and okay, we're gonna trade for him." He goes, and then I believe when they did make the trade, the famous trade for Brett Hall, I think he called Bob Plager, Ron Kron did, and he said, "I got my guy. I got my guy." Those are the famous words. "I got my guy," and obviously the rest is history.
Yeah. And I always like to think that, and I tell people that I announced every goal he ever scored in a Blues uniform. And so that's one of my favorite things to tell people, and who, when they are wondering who are you, Mr. Calhoun, or what do you do, I said, well, I announced every goal at the building whenever Brett Hull scored. Oh,
Yeah,
okay, well that wakes him up a little bit. But
that's awesome.
Hully, of course, Hully hasn't been on the podcast yet. We're still trying to chase him down and find a time that works for him, but we'll have him on here one of these days. He's living life large in Cabo San Lucas and other places these
Yeah,
days.
I got to tell you, Tom, every time the Post-Dispatch and now the Athletic, they'd call and say, "Hey, could you do a story on Brett Hall?" I know going into it, it's probably going to take about four or five messages before we can connect, so I can, feel your pain a little bit there. And I remember one time he was turning 50, and I was going to write a story about Brett Hall turning 50 years old. Who can believe it? Here's a guy that we saw in his prime score so many goals. And I think there was bad weather, and we got disconnected four or five times, but he did keep calling back. And Brett's a trooper. He's a good guy once you get him on the phone. And I remember another time I had interviewed him, and I said, "Hey Brett, this will just take a few more minutes. I apologize. I don't want to take up all your time." And he said, "Are you kidding me? I quit hockey for a year, and now I'm in the Hall of Fame, and I'm down in Cabo, and I got my own place here. Hockey gave me everything I have. You take all the time you want." So he's appreciative of all those years in St. Louis and what hockey gave him. So again, like Bobby Gassoff Jr., your podcast coming up with Brett Hall will be a good one too.
Looking forward to that. And did you ever talk to Hully about, his separation from the Blues, when he left and, they had contract issues and he winds up signing with Dallas. And, that was a tough pill for a lot of Blues fans to swallow.
Yeah, just a little bit. As I recall here, the one thing that sticks out that I remember the most is I think the Blues were saying that he wanted a no trade clause, and he said that wasn't accurate. I think what I got from both sides, and it was Larry Plow as the general manager at the time, just the time had come, right? If you want to use the term worn out the welcome from the team's perspective, things like that. There were a number of things, but yeah, definitely sad to see him move on to Dallas. Although what happens, he goes on and wins a cup and then wins another one, and that's the one thing is you can recall too that people said, well, you can't win a Stanley Cup with Brett Hall, and I've heard those exact words come out of Brett's mouth before. He said
Mhm.
that's what he heard so many times, so he felt fortunate to be able to go on and prove those people wrong.
Yeah, well, we'll bring that up when we get a chance to talk to him, see if he has any clarification on history back then.
Get ready for the greatest night in baseball presented by Dutch Hollow only at Arsenal BG Ballpark. We're kicking things off with a live pregame concert by baseball's best band, and during the game we're giving away 27 prizes, one for every single out, and a jersey off the back auction. Plus, meet real cowboys in a live bull as we gear up for the TK Pro Rodeo this October. And here's the best part. Buy rodeo tickets at the game and pay zero fees. Cap it all off with a post-game fireworks show, then help us send off the summer right by TPing the entire ballpark. Grab your tickets now, and we'll see you August 31st.
So, part of the Blues story too was when the Shanahan, Jack Quinn, Ron Caron team became sort of mavericks in the league and started challenging the salary structures, and they started signing free agents to big contracts. And one of those was Scott Stevens, a big free agent defenseman, then with Washington, and they signed him to a multi-year deal, 4 years for $7 million. That doesn't sound like a lot nowadays, but that was pretty big money back in those days, especially for the Blues, who were known to be, a penny pinching franchise, if you want to call it that. They had the lowest team payroll in the NHL when that all happened. So they signed him to this 4 year offer sheet and bring him in. He plays the 90-91 season here in St. Louis. He's the captain of the team. He's endearing himself to everyone here. And then Karan signs Brendan Shanahan in the next offseason. And he comes in, and the league is seeing all of this as, well, they're destroying our salary structure, or they're gonna ruin the way we do things in the NHL. And the Blues are given 5 days to compensate the New Jersey Devils for the signing of Shanahan. So that's that Judge Houston story that people bring up. Houston, we have a problem. The Blues offered Curtis Joseph and Rod Brindamore as compensation, but the Devils didn't take that, and so Houston awarded Scott Stevens back to the Devils to wrap up that sort of tragic moment in Blues history. And what's your take on that story?
Yeah, there's so many layers to this story actually, and I'll take it back a step further here. When the Blues got Stevens from Washington and gave up the first round draft picks, uh, again I go back to Bob Plager just has a hand in everything. He said that I believe he had a roommate at one point and this guy was an agent and took on Scott Stevens as a client. So the league saw the Blues acquiring Scott Stevens at the time because there was a Plager connection to him as a bit of a tampering issue as well, and therefore wanted to punish the Blues in some way, some form down the road. Like they never forgot about the Blues' connection to Scott Stevens and bringing him from Washington, even though they did give up the first round draft picks to get him. So as Bobby Plager put it, the league was kind of out to get the Blues from that situation, and then so then you have the Brendan Shanahan situation. And the Blues, as you mentioned, Curtis Joseph and Rod Brindamore were the players that they offered up. And who would think that in 2025 we'd still be talking about an arbitrator who made a decision in a Blues dispute years ago, but we can still remember Judge Houston's name and did not allow that package to go to the New Jersey Devils for Brendan Shanahan, in part, as the story goes, because he felt, as New Jersey argued, they had a goaltender, and so they didn't need to have Curtis Joseph. So they give him Scott Stevens. His time in St. Louis is short lived, and everybody felt that could have been the time after making the three Stanley Cup final appearances in the late 60s, early 70s. Okay, now the early 90s. This is the time that the Blues are going to win their Stanley Cup, and Scott Stevens gets stolen away from him. So there were some great moves by the management at that time to try to pick up that player, and then also Brendan Shanahan. And by the way, I do remember where I was when the Blues acquired Brendan Shanahan for Chris Pronger. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch sent me out to the public to get some public reaction to this trade. The Blues have traded fan favorite Brendan Shanahan for Chris Pronger, and I went to Ted Drew's because I lived about a mile away there in South St. Louis. I go to Ted Drew's. I'm sure I'm going to run into some Blues fans there, and I'm talking to a gentleman to get his opinion, and I'll never forget this. His wife was at the window ordering or receiving the ice cream. By the time she walked over to the two of us talking, a reporter and her husband, she said, "What is it, the death penalty question?" She just thought that I was a random person asking, what do you believe in the death penalty? And he said, "No, it's worse. The Blues just traded Brendan Shanahan. It's worse than the death penalty." And so I used that comment, that quote, in my story for the Post-Dispatch back when that trade was made. So, at the time, not many people knew about Chris Pronger or what type of player you're getting. Now you know that you got a Hockey Hall of Famer, so the trade looks a little better. But to go back to your question, those are some really, really big moves for the organization at the time. And unfortunately, back then, it didn't lead to a cup.
Sure didn't. We were still waiting for that cup to come along. By the way, as you can tell, Jeremy at this point is already working for the Post-Dispatch. I'm about 4 or 5 years into my run as a public address announcer for the team. And along comes the Wayne Gretzky trade from the LA Kings. And, nobody ever thought he could come to the Blues back in those days in 1996, but he did. And he's, obviously right off the bat, the captain of the team. Brett Hull says, "Yeah, no, he should be the captain, not me." So he is, and he has a nice season with the Blues, and they lose in the playoffs to Detroit, the famous Steve Yzerman goal. But along the way, Mike Keenan, who's coach then and sort of running the whole operation, is publicizing Gretzky for this and Gretzky for that, and so it was obvious that those two people weren't getting along, and it was a power struggle of some kind. And so at the end of the season, Gretzky rejects the $15 million 3-year offer from the Blues and goes off to finish his career with the New York Rangers in a 3-year deal there. So how could things have played out differently, and how would they have played out differently, in your opinion, Jeremy, had Mr. Gretzky been able to get along with Mr. Keenan?
Well, I think if there was any other coach, general manager in St. Louis, Wayne Gretzky probably would have finished his career here. Obviously, he was aware of what he was getting into. He heard the stories from Brett Hall, I'm sure, even when the trade happened. And by the way, Bruce Affleck tells some pretty good background on that trade. He said they had several high-level meetings in an attempt to acquire Wayne Gretzky from the LA Kings. And some of the detail, Tom, they went as far as to say, how many tickets have we not sold the rest of the season? How many empty seats do we have that we know will be sold and know will fill? And it basically paid Wayne Gretzky's salary the rest of the year if they were to sell out the rest of those seats the remainder of the season. So it was a no-brainer, obviously, to acquire the best player in the game and sell those tickets and see if he could have some chemistry with Brett Hall and take this team a little bit further. But it was short-lived. What was it? Just 18 regular season games, and then that playoff, which ended, on just still a memorable slash horrific note if you're the St. Louis Blues. And I don't have like conversations with Wayne Gretzky and Mike Keenan where I can thoroughly substantiate, how exactly it went down. But I've been told by people who were involved in the situation that, obviously Mike Keenan criticized Wayne Gretzky. There was some friction then. There was an offer on the table at one point. Then Mike Keenan pulled the offer off the table. And then I think Mike Keenan tried to make amends with Wayne Gretzky. And the story I was told, again, this is kind of third hand, but invited Wayne Gretzky up to his room to kind of talk it out, hash it out. And I think Mike had had a few cocktails at that point when he invited Wayne up, and I don't know that Wayne took him up on the offer. He said no thanks, and by that point, he was ready to go a different direction, and that's when he went to the New York Rangers. So when I started out this answer by saying if it were anybody else besides Mike Keenan, I think that's pretty accurate that they could have got a deal done with Wayne Gretzky to finish his career here in St. Louis.
Yeah, and boy, wouldn't that have been fun had he been able to, say goodbye at the Kiel Center slash Savas Center slash Enterprise Center, what it is now. So, um, but history is what it is, and on he went, and we're still glad that he thinks fondly of St. Louis and speaks that way on his national platform from time to time. So we move along to more recent times, and times that all of our listeners, no matter their age, should be familiar with. And let's talk a little bit about the playoff and Stanley Cup run in the 2019 season. Obviously spurred on by the acquisition of Ryan O'Reilly and the trade with Buffalo in the offseason before that season. Craig Berube replaces Mike Yeo in November of that season. February through March, you have that 11-game winning streak. Jordan Binnington, not much thought of at the time, comes up from the minors and gets a shutout in his first game in Philadelphia and starts in just a magical string of things. The glorious song, the Layla Anderson connection to the team. A lot of things. If you put it in a movie script, you wouldn't believe it. You couldn't get it. You couldn't get the movie made. There were so many magical things that happened along the way, from worst to the Stanley Cup champions, worst in January of that season to the Stanley Cup champions. Some of your thoughts on that big run?
Yeah, first of all, I was at the Athletic at the time, and after they won the Stanley Cup, I wanted to go back and look at the headlines from the entire season,
Hmm.
and I put three of them together, Tom, from the beginning, the middle, and the end. And it was the first one was empathy is setting in, because they had Stanley Cup hopes and they'd gotten off to a very poor start. And so fans, obviously, that there was a lot of empathy. And then the middle of the season, as you know, January, February, it was, could they really? Like, there was a headline like, could they get back into this playoff picture? And then the last headline was, these guys are legends. So you can see the contrast from the first headline to the last one of where that season went. I mean, like I don't even know where to start with this. You certainly go back to that Ryan O'Reilly trade, and I know many Blues fans are familiar with this detail here, but that trade does not happen if Patrick Berglund's agent turns in the no trade list to the St. Louis Blues, because Buffalo certainly would have been on that list, but his agent neglected to turn in the list to the Blues, which he had a certain date he had to do that by. And because he did not do that, the Blues were able to include him and Vladimir Sobotka and Tage Thompson in that trade. And so, what a huge trade in Blues history. Probably top five there, top two or three behind Brett Hull and a couple others. And so you get a big piece to that Stanley Cup team. And Ryan O'Reilly, he goes on to win the the Conn Smythe Trophy as the MVP for the playoffs. Let's talk about the coaching change. Mike Yeo came in kind of with a Stanley Cup or bust mentality that year, and it wasn't working at the start of the season, and the team lacked confidence. I remember going into that locker room, and you could just see it, a dejected group. And the first thing that Craig Berube said when he got the job as on an interim basis is he said we're going to restore this confidence, and he did. I mean, you've been around Craig Berube, and you know what kind of impact he can have on people around him, and so
Yeah.
that confidence came back. Jordan Bennington, he was fourth on the depth chart. Billy Huso had passed him, and Jordan Bennington played on a loan basis with the Providence Bears, with a different organization. As it turns out, the Boston Bruins organization kind
Yep.
of helped the Blues establish their goaltender that would beat them in the Stanley Cup final. So his story is miraculous. And then the Gloria thing, you were there every single night for those games at Enterprise Center, and just heard that song blaring. And still to this day, look, I know that it's gotten old for a lot of people, and there are probably some Blues fans who wouldn't care if they heard the song again as much as
Yeah.
it's connected to the Stanley Cup team. But how organic that was. I've interviewed the gentleman Larry Flowers, who was the guy who invited Blues players to the bar that night, Jack's Bar in Philadelphia. And the way Larry has told the story to me, he said that they're having a party for the Philadelphia Eagles playoff game, and the Blues players show up because they have a game in Philadelphia the next night. And he said the DJ is playing music in between quarters, halftime of the Eagles football game, and he happens to latch on to Gloria, and Robbie Fabry, who played for the Blues at the time, says, "Play Gloria again, play Gloria, play Gloria." And
Hmm.
Alex Steen is sitting next to Larry Flowers, and he says, "Look at that fella Fabry over there, just telling him to play Gloria again." And as Larry Flowers told me the story, he said that Alex Steen said, "If we win tomorrow night in Philadelphia, that's going to be our jam. That's going to be our post-game jam in the locker room." And they win 3-0, a shutout by Jordan Bennington. They play Gloria and continue to play Gloria for months and months, and now years and years.
Wow. Yeah, and how about Pat Maroon's double overtime goal? That doesn't happen if Dallas doesn't score on a what looked like an empty net a few seconds before that, and another piece of magic.
It was, and one of my favorite behind-the-scenes stories about that moment, Tom, you might be familiar with, is I talked to Jeff Wright. His nickname is Rubber. He was the longtime massage therapist for the
Right.
St. Louis Blues, and he texted me. I don't know if it was that night or the next day, but when the Blues were in the locker room for the intermission before the second overtime, as they walked out of the locker room and headed back to the ice for the start of the second OT, Pat Maroon was yelling, "Who's going to be the hero tonight?" That's what he was saying to his teammates as they were walking back out to the ice. Who's going to be the hero tonight? And a few minutes later, it was him.
And now Big Rig's a coach for his son in roller hockey, up in Minnesota, Mankato, right?
Yeah, he's got a couple things going on. He continues to play roller hockey, which he's done for years. And recently he played with his son Anthony and set up Anthony for a goal. So father son roller hockey goal. And then
Mhm.
now Anthony's continuing his career in the United States Hockey League, and Pat's going to be an assistant coach on that team.
And of course, we'll have to have the Big Rig on this
Yep, there's another
podcast.
one.
Yeah, here's another one. So those are some legendary moments. Of course, there are a lot more, and people listening to this podcast will say, "Well, what about this? What about that?" Well, we'll work on that in future podcasts. So don't think we've forgotten about some of the other big moments in Blues history. Let's talk before we let you go, Jr. About a couple of things. You're covering the team still on a regular basis. So we ought to talk about the upcoming season for just a minute. I see a lot of people pretty excited about what the Blues might be this coming season. How excited do you think fans really should be at this point?
Yeah, I think Blues fans should be excited for a couple of reasons. I think that, some people questioned the direction, the game plan of the organization, including myself. Like whenever I have these conversations, I don't want to be hypocritical or not acknowledge that I've had my own questions. Like maybe they should tear it down. Maybe this should be a rebuild. Maybe they should, finish in a position where they can get the first or second draft pick and go get one of those generational players. However, Doug Armstrong and Tom Stillman and the rest of the group have made the decision a couple years ago that they wanted to remain competitive. And so last year, When the team prior to the Four Nations face-off didn't look competitive, I think it was justified to still ask those questions. But this team, as you know, finished the season strong, should have won the first round of the playoffs and gone on to the second round. And so I think they're trending in the right direction, and they've made some more moves this offseason that should keep them competitive with Nick Bukestad coming in. And I'm going to have a tough one with this. I don't know if you're going to have a tough one. I talked to Suter the other day. I've
Hmm.
said it Pius Suter for years. He told me it's Puce Suter.
Hughes.
Is that
Yeah.
right? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hughes.
So
Yeah.
Pew Suter. So the Blues have added a couple veterans who are going to step in, and so here's where I have them. I have them. Can they flirt for third place in the Central Division? Yeah, I think they probably could. Should they be in line to win one of those wild cards? Yeah, I think they can if they stay healthy. But I think most importantly, regardless of what happens in this upcoming season, they've gone another year where these prospects are getting closer. They're getting better. Jimmy Snuggerud's here. Dalibor Dvorsky's, close to being here. And then you have the first round draft picks, the Swedes coming soon. The Blues are continuing to give you a reason to watch them and come to the arena every night. And at the same time, they're adding a ton of talent. 9 players who were in the World Juniors a couple years ago, and those guys, they're not all going to make it, but some of those guys are going to be here. So I think that the Blues shouldn't be looked at as a team that's a Stanley Cup contender. I don't know that they can finish first or second in the Central Division, but I know that they've made some good moves in the past couple years and have a really good chance to have as good of a season this coming year as they did last year, with the possibility of winning a round or two in the playoffs.
Well, there you go. This Logan Mailloux that they got in the Bolduc trade apparently is expected to be on the opening day roster. Am I right about that?
Yeah, that's the way it looks. Doug Armstrong said you're ready to play. I think that he kind of has nothing to prove in the American Hockey League anymore. He was one of the best defensemen in the minors last year, and I know some fans are still pretty upset to trade Zach Bolduc to Montreal, a guy who had 19 goals last year, could be a 30-goal scorer for Montreal this year. Could be a guy who's in the Canadians' top six in a couple years, like he could have been with the St. Louis Blues. But right-handed defensemen, young ones, are hard to come by, and Logan Mailloux is one of those. He can move the puck, he can shoot, and he can play in his own end, and he's also got some physicality to him. So if you put him in that third pair with Tucker, you got the makings of a pretty good young physical pair. So I do think that from what we've seen, read, and heard about Logan Mailloux, he's a real good pickup, even though you had to give up a good player to get him.
What's the status on Dylan Holloway? Is he ready to go?
Yep, yeah, by all accounts, he had surgery at the end of last year when the Blues they were wrapping up their playoffs. But Doug Armstrong said that he would be ready for the start of camp. And also, they had a player tour in Europe this past week where players from across the league who are in Europe in the off season do some interviews with the media, and Philip Broberg was one of those players who did interviews and said he's spoken with Dylan recently. He's doing great. He'll be ready for camp, and he's looking forward to seeing him. So that's going to be obviously a big add to the Blues lineup that they sorely missed in that playoff series against Winnipeg.
Yeah. And finally, JR, and thanks so much for
Oh,
for your time today. Appreciate it. What do you expect the swan song to be for Doug Armstrong as he gets ready to transition over to Alex Steen? What's that going to look like?
yeah, I think big picture, Tom, the fact that Doug Armstrong is still going to be under contract and be the president of hockey operations for at least 3 more years after this season, he's still going to be around. He's still going to have a handprint, fingerprint, if you will, on the team. I know that Alexander Steen, to me, he's a real good choice to take over this team. I know he doesn't have GM experience, but he drips hockey knowledge. You've been around him. He just knows the game. He knows the people. He knows the culture that's needed so well. But he is going to be raw in a lot of areas, even though he'll do this GM in waiting for 2 years. And he's going to need Doug Armstrong, I'm sure, multiple times a day to, hey, what do I do in this situation? And so Doug Armstrong will still be around. In terms of the swan song, he'll be appreciated, respected, honored by the team, by the fans. and this his final year as general manager. I've been around since he came here in 2008, and he was the GM in waiting for 2 years before he took over for Larry Plow in 2010. So a lot of success. His numbers are right up there. I think he's a Hall of Famer. He'll be in the Hockey Hall of Fame for his work in the management booth. And I think that the Blues and their fans will show their appreciation at probably several points this season.
Thanks for your great input here today, JR, and thanks for those watching on YouTube, allowing them to get to see your man cave there with the hockey rink in the background. That's pretty special.
A lot of fun. 2020, we thought we'd put a storage area back there, and we said, you only live once, let's put a hockey rink back there. So we do have the synthetic ice for the young kids to skate on. And then, Tom, I told you earlier that the sticker back there, if people can see that, those are fans at a Blues game. And it's actually the watch party from Enterprise Center in 2019, Game 7. The team, of course, was in Boston. But these were the fans that were in the house at Enterprise Center. And I've actually had friends come over to my house and kind of scan the crowd and find themselves. One fan, in fact, who went back to the video on their phone, saw what section they were sitting in that night, and then found that section on the sticker and were able to find themselves. So pretty cool little piece to have when fans come over and they can talk about that night and how exciting it was to be at the watch party.
Authentic logos on the boards and everything. That's pretty special stuff.
From Jim Schmucky.
Yeah, there you go. Oh, boy. All right, maybe we'll have Schmucky on, too. He's about to retire, I think, from being the ice master down at the Enterprise Center.
Yep.
But, JR, thanks so much, and we'll do this again sometime. Talk about your book real quick before you go and your subscription to The Athletic.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I love the podcast, listen to it. And I just want to point out, if you are looking for a copy of the book, it is called 100 Things Blues Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die. You can find it at Amazon. And also, if you're a Bernie Federko fan, I know you mentioned it at the top of the show, but I wrote his autobiography along with him, My Blue Note with Bernie Federko. He was tremendous. It was 20 trips out to Bernie's house, 5 hours a time, 100 hours of audio with Bernie Federko, and we pieced it all together and made a book out of it. That's also at Amazon. And if you aren't a subscriber to The Athletic, you can go to theathletic.com, and we have continued coverage of the St. Louis Blues, and we'll be ramping that up pretty soon as training camp gets close.
And you can hear JR regularly on 101 ESPN as well, and you've got that what's it called?
Yeah, Last Minute Blues podcast. Yep.
Last Minute Blues podcast, right. So we'll look forward to hearing more from you there as well. JR, great to be seen and see you as well on the podcast, and we'll see one another again soon down at Enterprise Center. Appreciate your time.
You as well, Tom. Thank you.
Thanks for being with me for another episode of the St. Louis Blues Hockey Legends Podcast. We'll have another legend coming up soon, so stay tuned to our social media for news on who that legend might be. Visit PAGuyTom.com or BluesHockeyLegends.com and sign up for our Legends email notifications. The Legends Podcast is also available on the Scoops Sports Network at scoopswithdannymac.com. Video of the podcast is published the Monday after the Friday release of the audio. As always, please like and share on Facebook, X, and Instagram, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It all keeps the Legends Podcast alive and well. Tom Calhoun here saying thanks for being a fan, and let's go Blues!